I was a bank teller in Philadelphia, the kind of invisible cog who handed out 20s with a smile and watched lives flicker across laminated IDs. I learned patterns, faces, and the gentle tremor of fear when money changed hands that shouldn't be together. That is how the Russian mob found me, and that is how I found the seam in their armor. This is a confession dressed as a survival manual and a love story wrapped in a lie. It begins with a small favor at a neighborhood branch, turns into a silent war fought in account ledgers and backrooms, and explodes when $6 million vanish without a siren. There is a woman whose truth costs more than cash, a best friend who mistakes loyalty for ownership, a handler who never raises his voice, but always raises the stakes, and a city that eats the timid and applauds the audacious. I will take you from the fluorescent hush of a teller line to the thick breath of late-night kitchens in South Philly, from steel doors in Northeast row houses to cold rooms where names are recited like debts. You will see how love grows in unsafe soil, how a lie becomes a bridge, and how a clean escape is never clean. Expect moral whiplash, a heartbeat that outruns the clock, and an ending that tastes like victory when it lands and like ash when the light comes up. If you want stories that grab your collar and won't let go, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I started out believing that the worst thing money could do to a person was make them talk louder, but Philadelphia taught me money has quieter tricks, like teaching you the exact weight of your own heartbeat. I was the man behind the glass counting other people's decisions 10/20s at a time, a polite metronome in a navy blazer, the person you forget as soon as your receipt curls into your pocket. From that vantage point, you learn to read a city the way paramedics read pulse. You learn the on-payday sigh, the divorce withdrawal stare, the contractor's swagger, the gambler's apology. You also learn what fear looks like when it's dressed as routine, when men walk in with the same brand new work boots and the same clean nails and the same exact envelopes that say legitimate in the way a too-neat lawn says no one actually lives here. They came from the Northeast, from tidy row houses with metal gates that were more decoration than defense, men who smelled faintly of clove and aftershave and had a talent for never making eye contact longer than a handshake. They called me buddy and tipped in compliments, the kind that made a teller feel like a magician for doing arithmetic. The first time I met the one who mattered, he didn't speak until after the cash was counted twice. He was compact, all edges, the kind of man who seemed permanently braced for a sudden stop. He slid one finger along the counter as if testing a blade and asked, softly, whether our branch valued efficiency. I said yes, because that's what my training manual told me to say to anything that wasn't a robbery note. His name at the window was always different, but the eyes stayed the same and the suit never wrinkled. He began bringing deposits that weren't illegal on paper and weren't normal in the bones, the sort of money that makes you aware of your hands. When I filed the forms you're supposed to file when a pattern hums too loudly, a manager in a better suit called me careful, and a day later the soft-voiced man appeared with a smile that said we were now colleagues in some new, unspoken department. That was how the door opened, not with a threat, but with gratitude that weighed more. At night, I would walk home along Passyunk and let the city explain itself. On certain blocks, every front step was a confession booth, people practicing their arguments to the street. On others, you could hear pans in restaurant kitchens tonging like distant bells. That's where I met her, in a late-night place that specialized in soups priced like secrets. She sat alone with her back to the wall, a woman who arranged herself around exits out of habit. She wasn't beautiful in the way a magazine explains beauty. She was beautiful in the way a bruise becomes a map you keep touching. Her name was Lena, and it lived in her mouth like something that had cost her. She laughed once when I lied and told her I was an assistant manager. She said only men who are afraid of being invisible bother with titles after midnight. She had arrived in the city by way of a winter that hadn't forgiven her, and she carried the crisp courtesy of someone who has spent too much time proving she is safe to sit beside. We became regulars at the same table, two people pretending we were just killing time because admitting we were saving each other felt expensive. She never asked what I did, not really, and I never asked why she counted the door chime by instinct. Real intimacy is made of things we choose not to say. I found out about her brother by accident, the way you find out you're bleeding when you see her hands. A voicemail she played accidentally, A man's voice stating a number the way a doctor states a prognosis. After that, I started to chart the men from the Northeast the way you chart weather. If you watch long enough, every storm has a rhythm. They kept to calendar holidays and end-of-quarter shadows. They trusted a system they didn't respect, which is the same as leaving your keys in the car because you think no one in this neighborhood drives stick. The soft-voiced one, I later learned he answered to Misha when he forgot not to, liked to test the teller line with small frictions, seeing who broke, who smiled wider. I became his favorite because I knew how to be useful without acting eager, and because I had the kind of face that looks like it belongs to other people. He started asking for tiny favors that were, in aggregate, a map, a hold released an hour early, a discrepancy nudged toward resolved, a phone number that rang to a man who always said, "my friend," as if it were a warning. None of it would have meant more than a memo if not for Lena's brother, who existed for me in numbers and silence. The night I realized the two currents ran parallel, I couldn't hear the television in my apartment over the sound of my own thoughts. Philadelphia has a way of applauding the audacious and forgetting the careful. I had been careful my entire life. I had been the kid who counted the change from the pizza box and returned the quarters, the young man who didn't gamble because he suspected he would be good at it. I had a best friend named Marco who worked nights as a security guard and days as a philosopher, and he loved me in the possessive way that people do when your caution makes them feel safer. He believed in rules because breaking them would require admitting we were both small. Marco called the men I was dealing with imported problems and called Lena complicated. He meant it a shelter and it sounded like a lock. That was the first fracture. The second was when I discovered that the branches systems, like any system designed by optimists, assumed people intended to be honest. There were places where the rails didn't quite meet. I won't tell you where because I'm not your guide to bad decisions. I'm your cautionary tale wearing cologne. I will tell you that the cracks looked like mercy if you squinted, and that bureaucracies always build escape hatches for themselves that others can learn to use. I began to imagine a shape that was not quite a plan and not quite a prayer, making the men from the Northeast believe that their money was safer in my hands than in theirs, and then proving it to them so thoroughly they would let me carry it. Love only becomes bravery when it gets a price tag, and Lena had set mine without trying. The first time I entertained the thought of stealing from them, it felt like standing at the top of the art museum steps, wind in my teeth, the city a dare. It wasn't greed. It was the arithmetic of fear measured against the compound interest of hope. If you stack enough careful days together, you start to mistake the stack for a wall. I was tired of being safe. I was tired of answering to men who wore politeness like Kevlar. I was tired of a city that only noticed me when my drawer was off by $7. So I practiced being visible in small ways, an extra second of eye contact, a smile with corners that implied we understood each other. In return, I was given more to carry, and then more, until I held a thread that hummed with $6 million worth of pressure. You don't steal that kind of money in one move. You invite it to walk beside you, and you never let it know it's being led. The night the idea hardened into intention, Lena told me she hated the smell of bleach because it reminded her of starting over. I said starting over was just cleaning a room you actually wanted to live in. We both pretended we were talking about something else. I walked her home past shutters and sleeping windows, and on her stoop, she touched my wrist like a promise with conditions. After she went inside, I stood there in the quiet, a man with a job and a secret, a friend who was about to become a problem, a city at my back that would forgive a sin if it came with a good story. I decided to write one. The first time I touched their money outside the glass, it felt less like theft and more like audition. Misha left an envelope that wasn't supposed to exist, a slip in protocol that was too neat to be accident. He watched me the way men watch card tables, half amusement, half hunger. I carried it from counter to vault, every step an accusation. Inside the vault, where the air is thick with metal and time, I opened it just enough to see the kind of green that only travels in caravans. 6 figures, unremarkable in ink, extraordinary in weight. My hands wanted to shake, but years of customer service had trained them steady. I closed the envelope, logged it as if it belonged, and in that moment, I stopped being invisible. That night I couldn't sleep. The radiator clicked like a metronome to my thoughts. I thought about Lena's brother, about the way she stiffened at every number, every reminder of debt that wasn't hers. I thought about Marco, about how his loyalty was a blanket that kept me warm but also pinned me down. I thought about Misha, who spoke softly so you'd forget to fear him until you noticed you hadn't exhaled in minutes. And I thought about 6 million, not as cash but as escape. Philadelphia doesn't give you futures. It lends you hours you have to pay back with interest. 6 million was more than money, it was a time machine. Weeks passed like confession. Each shift I took, Misha gave me more to carry. Irregular transfers smoothed into normalcy, flagged activity that disappeared like smoke. Each favor was a fingerprint pressed on my conscience, and soon I was covered. I began building a system in my head, a choreography of how the money moved and where it paused, how it could be nudged toward doors no one watched. You don't just plan to steal from the Russian mob. You draft scenarios, then burn them, then write them again until the paper tastes like blood. I found the cracks in the institution were wider than any single man. Regulations that looked tight on posters were loose in practice. I could reroute a deposit through the same channels that held government pensions, then shadow it with routine withdrawals until it vanished under the noise. But plans are useless without reasons, and my reason had eyes that refused to lie. Lena didn't know she was giving me courage. She thought she was just surviving, carrying her brother's debt like a second spine. But every time she smiled at me across that table, soup cooling between us, I felt the math change. A man doesn't risk everything for money. He risks it because someone else makes survival look insufficient. Marco noticed first. He noticed me spending nights restless, noticed my clothes smell like smoke from kitchens I shouldn't have been in, noticed my phone buzz and me pretending it was no one. He asked if I was gambling, because gambling was the only sin he could forgive. I told him no, and for the first time in our friendship, that no built a wall instead of a bridge. Marco's loyalty was fierce, but fierce things get brittle when they're tested. I knew he would become a problem, maybe even before I wanted him to. Misha had a way of watching me that was worse than threats. He would tilt his head slightly, as if weighing me on a scale no one else could see. One afternoon, he told me a story about a man in Brighton Beach who misplaced $500,000 in cash. He described the funeral like it was a dinner party, the music, the food, the laughter afterward. He never said the man's name. He never said the word warning. But when he stood, his hand lingered on the counter, and I understood. Every dollar was alive, and every dollar had a witness. By then the idea was no longer an idea. It was a heartbeat, stubborn and steady. 6 million was not sitting in one pile. It moved in arteries, through accounts with names no one answered to, into properties that smelled like bleach and silence. My job was not to grab it, but to redirect it, strand by strand, until the strands made a rope strong enough to climb out. The night I decided the clock had started, Lena told me about a childhood winter in a village where the snow came up to the windows and her mother melted ice for tea. She said scarcity teaches you how to taste. I said wealth teaches you how to waste. She laughed, but in her eyes I saw the truth. She would never waste, not one coin, not one chance. That was when I knew the plan was real. Not for me. For us. You can justify anything if you rename it love. The first move was small, almost laughable. A single transaction rerouted through a dormant account, the kind of bureaucratic oversight that would vanish under 100 other oversights. No one noticed. Not the bank, not the regulators, not even Misha. Especially not Misha. And in that silence, I heard possibility. That night, I walked home past shuttered storefronts and sleeping rowhouses. The city stretched like a held breath. I knew two things. I was going to take 6 million from men who killed for less, and once I started, there was no stopping. You don't rehearse a confession. You live it until the end. Stealing money is never about the numbers. It's about rhythm. You learn how often regulators check, how often managers sign without reading, how often men like Misha blink. My rhythm became sleepless nights, paper-cut mornings, and an ache in my chest that wasn't fear so much as anticipation. Every shift was a rehearsal where the audience didn't know there was a play. I kept the move small. Deposits rerouted, withdrawals delayed by seconds, a ledger adjusted by fractions. The money didn't vanish, it drifted. Like snow melting into drains, gone without ceremony. By the third month, I had siphoned off more than I ever thought possible without tripping alarms. Each success built a new hunger, not for cash, but for the silence that followed. Silence meant I was still invisible, and invisibility was my weapon. But invisibility is fragile. Marco began pressing harder, the way only a friend who knows your footsteps can. He asked me to meet him on his security shift, in the hollow of a building that smelled like concrete and boredom. He said he could tell when I was lying, that my voice had changed, that I had started speaking like someone who thought of exit routes. He asked if it was a woman. I wanted to say yes, because love is easier to confess than crime. But I stayed quiet, and that silence wounded him deeper than any answer. In his eyes, I saw the first spark of betrayal, not because I had wronged him, but because I had excluded him. Marco was the kind of man who could forgive a crime, but not a secret. Meanwhile, Misha sharpened his attention. He started sending others to the branch, new faces with the same boots and the same envelopes, men who smirked like they were delivering tests. One left a 20 on the counter, folded wrong. Another asked my middle name and smiled when I answered. They were probing the edges, looking for tremors. Misha never asked directly, but his presence was a shadow across every move. And then Lena's brother reappeared, not in person, but in debt. She confessed one night over soup that the number had doubled, that the men had found him again, that she was terrified she would have to trade herself to save him. Her voice cracked on the word family, and in that crack my plan hardened into inevitability. This was no longer about stealing. This was about rescue. That night I mapped out the acceleration. The siphoning wasn't enough. 6 million would take years at the current rhythm, and years were a luxury neither of us had. I began to plot the fracture point, the day when the accounts could be forced open in a single sweep, masked as transfers so ordinary no one would notice until they were gone. But the closer I moved to that point, the more brittle everything around me became. Marco confronted me again, this time with a kind of desperate anger. He said I was dragging myself into shadows, that he'd rather lose me as a friend than see me vanish into something he couldn't protect me from. He begged me to tell him the truth, just once, so he could decide whether to follow or to walk away. I wanted to trust him, but trust is a currency more dangerous than cash. So I lied. I told him I was seeing someone I couldn't introduce him to, and the look in his eyes, relief, disappointment, jealousy all braided together, was worse than any gun. Misha escalated too. One afternoon, he leaned in and told me, quietly, that Philadelphia was a city that rewarded boldness, but never forgave mistakes. He asked me if I had ever made a mistake I couldn't erase. I said no, and he smiled like a man who had just written my name in a ledger I would never see. My nights with Lena became brighter against that darkness. She confessed things in fragments, how her mother died in a country that didn't remember her name, how her brother had been her shadow and her burden, how she sometimes dreamed of boarding a bus without a ticket and never looking back. Each confession was another anchor tying me to the plan. I didn't want escape for myself anymore. I wanted escape for her, even if it meant I would never see the outside of it. By the 4th month, the architecture of theft was complete. I had pathways that could funnel millions through dormant accounts, cover them with the noise of payrolls and state checks, and bleed them into a shell so ordinary it looked like neglect. The system was a cathedral built from small lies, and all it needed was a spark to burn. That spark came when Misha asked me to move a transfer larger than anything before. His voice was casual, but the weight of the request was not. It was 6 figures in one sweep, delivered with the softness of a man offering tea. I realized then he either trusted me completely or he was testing me fatally. Both were dangerous, but one gave me exactly what I needed. That night, I walked the city alone, every street lamp a question. The skyline looked like teeth, jagged and merciless. I thought about Marco's warning, about Lena's trembling hands, about Misha's smile. And I knew the heist wasn't coming someday. It was coming now. You don't choose the moment. The moment chooses you. The day it happened didn't announce itself. The bank smelled the same, like toner and carpet, the same parade of paychecks and apologies, the same artificial calm. But underneath, I could feel it, the hum of inevitability. I had rehearsed the sequence so many times in my head it was no longer numbers, it was muscle memory. One keystroke rerouted a transfer through a dormant shell. Another stacked it beneath payroll deposits, so thick no one would question a fraction out of place. A third moved it again, hidden inside the noise of municipal checks. $6 million was no longer in one place. It was bleeding invisibly across accounts, drifting like smoke into a room no one had locked. My hands never shook. My face never betrayed me. To the customers I was still the teller, the man behind the glass, the metronome of routine. But in my chest, every beat was a countdown. By lunch, the money was gone, already dissolving into the structure I'd built. By closing, the ledger balanced, the reports clean, the system smiling back at itself in ignorance. On paper, nothing had happened. In reality, I had stolen from men who carved lessons into bone. I walked out into the winter dusk, the air sharp enough to remind me I was alive. Every sound felt amplified, the rattle of a train, the scrape of a shoe, the laugh of a stranger. The city looked the same, but it wasn't. Because now it was mine. I didn't go straight to Lena. I couldn't. Too dangerous. Instead, I went home, sat in the dark, and listened to my building breathe. Every creak in the pipes sounded like footsteps on the stairs. Every car outside sounded like men arriving. I told myself I had time, that by the time anyone noticed, the money would be buried too deep to retrieve. But lies feel thin when the stakes are flesh. The first crack came sooner than I expected. Marco showed up unannounced. He had that look, the one that meant he'd pieced together fragments into a truth I didn't want him to see. He asked me point blank, what had I done? His voice shook, not with anger, but with fear, the kind of fear a man feels when the person he trusts most has become unrecognizable. I tried to deflect, to lie, but Marco knew my lies too well. He told me he had seen men watching the bank, not the usual watchers, but harder, quieter ones. He begged me to stop whatever I was doing, to vanish if I could, to leave before the city swallowed me whole. And in that plea, I heard something worse than suspicion. I heard love twisted into desperation. He would protect me, even from myself. And that made him dangerous. I left him in my apartment and walked until the cold numbed me. South Philly streets whispered with the smell of frying onions and cigarettes, the ghosts of conversations I couldn't join. I ended up outside Lena's building without meaning to. When she opened the door, she saw it in my face before I spoke. She didn't ask how, didn't ask why. She just asked if it was enough. I told her yes, though I didn't know if 6 million was enough to outpace men who had buried others for half. That night we made plans in whispers, like fugitives rehearsing a dream. She would get her brother, settle him somewhere far enough he'd stop being bait. We would disappear in different directions, meet again only when it was safe. But safe is a word for people who don't know. The following morning, the first tremor hit. Misha arrived at the branch, not with an envelope, but with a stare that pinned me to the counter. He didn't ask about transactions. He didn't ask about numbers. He asked me if I believed in God. I told him I did. He smiled, soft and thin, and said God helps only those who don't lie to themselves. Then he left, and the air felt heavier, as though he'd carved my name into it. I knew then they suspected. They didn't know yet, but they suspected. And suspicion is a disease that spreads faster than truth. Marco called that night, his voice urgent. He said men had been asking about me, not police, not bankers, but the kind of men who don't wear uniforms because uniforms get in the way of funerals. He begged me to come clean to him, to let him stand beside me instead of against me. But trust, once withheld, becomes impossible to give. I lied again. And this time, I saw what it did to him. His silence was heavier than any threat Misha had ever given. I realized I had made an enemy not of the Mafia, but of my best friend. The money was gone, untraceable by any logic except mine. But people aren't ledgers. They can't be balanced, can't be reconciled. Marco's suspicion, Lena's desperation, Misha's shadow, they were all moving pieces, and I couldn't control them. $6 million had bought me freedom on paper. In reality, it had bought me war. And war was already at my door. War doesn't arrive with an announcement. It arrives with silence that feels wrong. For 3 days after the sweep, nothing happened. No calls, no men at my door, no shifts out of place. The bank hummed like any other week, customers lining up with sighs and smiles, the system oblivious. But underneath, I could feel the absence like a toothache. When predators go quiet, it means they're circling. On the fourth night, Marco was waiting outside my building. He didn't speak at first, just looked at me like a man trying to recognize a ghost wearing his friend's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, almost rehearsed. He told me he had been followed, that two men in a black sedan had tailed him after his shift, that they weren't interested in him so much as the fact that he was close to me. He said he didn't sleep anymore, that he dreamed of headlights and locked trunks. And then he told me something worse, that he had been approached. A man with cold hands had asked him if he trusted me. That was all. No threats, no bargains, just the question. And Marco, loyal, stubborn Marco, hadn't answered. His silence was his protection, and in that silence he became a liability. I told him to stay away from me, to cut ties before the ropes strangled us both. But he refused. He said friendship meant drowning together if it came to it. I didn't have the heart to tell him drowning together was exactly what Misha wanted. Meanwhile, Lena's brother was collapsing under his own debts. She confessed to me that the men had started pressing harder, visiting her building, leaving notes without signatures. Her hands shook when she told me she feared they'd take her instead, that her brother's life had already been forfeit and they wanted collateral made of flesh. That night she cried, and I held her, and in that moment I realized the heist hadn't bought freedom, it had bought delay. We were still in the cage, only the bars were gold now. Misha's approach changed too. He no longer sent others with envelopes or casual questions. He came himself, lingered longer, watched me work as if memorizing every keystroke. One afternoon, he leaned over the counter and told me about a teller in Chicago who thought he was clever, who believed in cracks in the system. He said the man disappeared one day, and all that remained was a rumor that he had tried to rewrite meth. He smiled when he finished, as if daring me to laugh. I didn't. That night I considered running. Taking Lena and her brother, leaving Marco to his suspicions, disappearing into a bus station blur. But money makes you arrogant. I told myself I could still manage it, that I was too careful, too smart, too invisible. That was the lie that kept me breathing. The first real fracture came 2 weeks later. I returned to my apartment to find the door ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen, nothing broken. But on the kitchen table sat an envelope with a $1 bill inside, folded into the shape of a coffin. No note, no demand. Just a message, we know. I burned it in the sink, but the smoke clung to me like guilt. Marco came the next morning, furious, accusing me of dragging him into something I refused to name. He shouted that he had given me loyalty, and in return I had given him fear. He said if I didn't tell him the truth, he would go to the police, not because he wanted me punished, but because he wanted to save me from myself. For the first time, I saw him not as a friend, but as a threat. A threat wearing love-like armor. And threats had to be managed. That night I met Lena again, told her the plan had to accelerate. We couldn't wait for suspicion to harden into certainty. We needed to leave soon. She agreed, but her eyes were distant, heavy. She told me her brother was falling apart, drinking himself numb, talking too loudly in bars. He was going to get us all killed, she whispered. And for the first time, I saw a shadow of doubt in her too. Was she willing to leave him behind if it came to it? I didn't ask, because I already knew the answer and I wasn't sure I liked it. The pressure built like a storm you can smell but not see. Marco watching me like a brother-turned-detective. Misha circling with quiet menace. Lena caught between blood and survival. The 6 million sat like a weight in hidden accounts, useless until it became escape, and deadly until then. Every night I dreamt of headlights, of coffins made of folded bills, of a city that didn't care whether I drowned or flew. Philadelphia rewards the audacious, punishes the careful, and forgets the cautious. I had been all three, and now I was running out of roles to play. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. And the first casualty was going to be someone I loved. The end never feels like an ending when you're inside it. It feels like another errand, another evening, another shadow that follows too close. But looking back, I know the moment it broke. It was a Wednesday, unremarkable, gray skies pressing low. The bank was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a throat being cleared before bad news. Misha came in alone this time. He didn't approach the counter. He sat in the waiting area, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on me with the stillness of a predator who has already decided how the hunt ends. I worked my shift pretending not to notice, but every keystroke felt like confession. When the doors finally locked and the last customer drifted out, Misha rose. He didn't walk to me. He walked past me into the manager's office without knocking. Minutes later, my manager called me in. Misha was sitting in the chair like it belonged to him, smiling faintly. He said nothing. My manager cleared his throat, stammered something about irregularities, about questions that needed answering. And then Misha spoke, soft as always, asking if I believed mistakes could be forgiven. I told him yes. He smiled wider and said, "Not these." That night I didn't go home. I went straight to Lena. She opened the door, her eyes red, her brother slumped drunk on the couch behind her. She whispered that men had been by, that they had made it clear his debt was hers now, that the clock was no longer ticking, it had struck. She asked if the money was ready, if we could leave. I told her yes, but my voice cracked. Because what I had built was fragile, an illusion of escape, and Misha was already inside it. Marco showed up the next day. He wasn't angry anymore. He was broken. He told me he had been followed again, that someone had cornered him in a parking lot and asked if he wanted to live. He said he couldn't protect me anymore, that whatever I had done had gone too far. He begged me one last time to tell him the truth, to let him help. And I almost did. Almost. But then I saw it, the flicker of fear in his eyes, the realization that love had turned into burden. If I told him, he would break. And if he broke, they'd use him. So I lied again. And that lie ended us. That evening, as I left work, I felt the city closing in. A car slowed beside me, windows tinted too dark. I braced for violence, but instead a note slid from the window onto the pavement. For words, handwritten in block letters, "Time is almost up." I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. That night Lena and I made the decision. We would take what we had and run, her brother willing or not. We would leave Philadelphia behind, burn every bridge, vanish into the noise of another city. The money was ready, hidden in places no one would think to look until too late. All that remained was courage. But courage is fickle. On the night we were meant to go, Marco called me. His voice was flat, hollow. He said he had told them. Not everything, he didn't know everything, but enough. Enough for them to know I wasn't clean. He said he was sorry, but he thought it was the only way to keep me alive. His voice broke when he said my name. Then the line went dead. Minutes later, Lena burst into my apartment, breathless, saying her brother was gone, that the men had taken him, that she couldn't leave without him. She begged me to help. And in that moment, every plan unraveled. I had stolen $6 million, but I couldn't buy loyalty, couldn't buy silence, couldn't buy family. I had love, but love tied me to a sinking ship. I had a best friend, but his protection had become betrayal. And I had enemies who already knew my name. We didn't leave that night. We didn't leave at all. The war had found us, and the city was watching, waiting to see who would crawl out. Philadelphia doesn't forgive. It only remembers and whispers. The heist was perfect on paper, but paper burns. And in the ashes, all that remained was choice, to fight, to run, or to fall. I still don't know which one I made, but I know this. $6 million never felt heavier than the night it couldn't carry us away. If you want more stories that choke you with their truth and leave you questioning every choice, hit like and subscribe. Because some endings are just the beginning of another confession. The night after everything collapsed, I walked the city like a man already dead, waiting for the body to notice. Philadelphia was louder than usual, sirens that weren't for me, laughter that cut too sharp, headlights that held too long. I kept expecting the car to slow, the door to open, the end to step out with a gun and no ceremony. But it didn't. The silence was worse. Lena hid in my apartment, pacing like an animal in a cage. She hadn't slept. Her brother was gone, taken by men who wouldn't give him back for money alone. She kept saying his name like a prayer, like a curse. She wanted me to use the 6 million to buy him out. But that was never the price. Men like Misha don't trade. They teach. And the lesson would be written in blood. Marco didn't call again. I thought about him constantly, about the sound of his voice when he told me he had betrayed me to save me. I wanted to hate him, but all I felt was the heavy ache of friendship deformed into something unrecognizable. He had tried to save me from myself, and in doing so had destroyed me. That's what loyalty becomes when stretched too thin. It snaps and cuts everyone holding it. The days blurred. I stopped going to the bank. Every time I thought about the branch, about the glass, the ledgers, the faces, I felt a sickness crawl up my throat. I wasn't a teller anymore. I was a thief with no plan, no exit, no future. The 6 million sat in the dark like a mirror showing me the worst parts of myself. Money doesn't save. It only reflects. Then came the summons. A knock at the door, polite, steady. When I opened it, 2 men stood there. Suits too neat, eyes too flat. They didn't threaten. They didn't push past me. They simply said Misha wanted a word. Lena grabbed my arm, her nails biting my skin, whispering not to go. But not going was never an option. Men like Misha don't send invitations, they send verdicts. They drove me to a warehouse near the river, the kind of place that smells of rust and endings. Inside, Misha sat at a table like a teacher waiting for a late student. On the table sat a single object, a silver lighter engraved with Cyrillic letters I couldn't read. He asked me to sit. His voice was soft, almost kind. He told me about his childhood in Odessa, about hunger, about men who taught him that survival meant making examples. He said I had disappointed him, not because I took the money, but because I thought I could hide. He leaned closer then, eyes sharp as razors, and asked me the question I had been dreading. Was it worth it? I wanted to lie. I wanted to beg. But instead I thought of Lena, of her brother, of Marco, of every heartbeat that had carried me to this chair. And I told him yes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lit the lighter, flame dancing between us, and whispered that the fire always comes for liars. He closed it, stood, and walked away. The men drove me back without a word. They didn't touch me, didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. The message was clear. I was living on borrowed time, and the interest was compounding. When I returned, Lena was waiting, hope and terror braided in her face. She asked what they wanted. I told her the truth, that they hadn't killed me because they wanted me to suffer first. She didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. That night we lay in silence, 2 fugitives in a bed that felt like a coffin. The city outside hummed, alive, indifferent. $6 million sat between us like a corpse we couldn't bury. And I realized then, there was no escape. Not for me. Maybe not even for her. Because once you steal from the kind of men who own silence, you don't get to leave. You only get to wait. Wait for the headlights. Wait for the knock. Wait for the lighter to spark. That's the true cost of 6 million. It doesn't buy freedom. It buys time. And time always runs out. The last week of my life as a free man didn't feel like a week. It felt like a held breath that refused to end. Lena barely left the apartment, pacing, smoking, whispering prayers in Russian I couldn't understand. Her brother never came back. The men had taken him, and silence was all the answer we would ever get. Marco didn't call again. I imagined him drinking alone, hating me, hating himself more. Sometimes friendship dies not with a fight, but with exhaustion. And Misha? He no longer needed to come to the bank. His presence was everywhere, in the cars that slowed when I walked, in the shadows that lingered outside the building, in the feeling that even my dreams weren't mine anymore. On a Friday night, the city buzzing with its usual chaos, I told Lena it was time. We couldn't wait for a miracle that would never come. The 6 million was ready, scattered and disguised, but it wasn't money anymore. It was the only weapon I had left. We would take it, disappear, even if it meant leaving her brother behind in the dark. She didn't answer at first. Then she looked at me with eyes so tired they seemed older than the city itself and whispered, "Then we're already dead." We left before dawn. Bags packed, cash disguised, identities half formed in my pocket. The plan was simple. Bus to New York, flight under borrowed names, vanish into the noise of another life. But plans don't survive men like Misha. The street was empty, too empty. No headlights, no footsteps, only the sound of our shoes on the pavement. Then came the car, rolling silent, black windows reflecting nothing. It stopped a few feet away. Doors opened. 2 men stepped out, but not Misha. They didn't need to speak. I pushed Lena behind me, clutching the bag that had become our lifeline. My heart hammered, not with fear, but with clarity. This was the bill coming due. The taller man gestured, calm, precise. I understood. Give up the bag, give up the money, maybe live. But maybe not. Because men like these don't negotiate, they erase. I looked at Lena. Her lips trembled, but her eyes told me everything. If I handed it over, we were finished anyway. So I did the only audacious thing left. I laughed. A small, broken laugh that felt like defiance. And I threw the bag into the gutter, hard, where the seams tore and money spilled like leaves into the wind. Bills scattered down the street, fluttering under the first pale light of dawn. $6 million, untouchable, suddenly belonged to no one. The men froze, just for a second. Enough. I grabbed Lena's hand and ran. Ran harder than I had ever run in my life, lungs burning, shoes slapping against cracked pavement. Behind us, shouts, footsteps, but no gunfire. Not yet. Maybe they wanted us alive. Maybe they were laughing too. We turned corners blindly, cutting through alleys, past dumpsters, past graffiti that looked like warnings. My chest ached, my vision blurred, but I didn't stop. Because stopping meant death and running at least meant choice. We didn't make it far. A car cut us off, headlights blinding. Doors opened again, and this time Misha stepped out. Calm, immaculate. That same silver lighter in his hand. He didn't raise a gun. He didn't need to. He just looked at me, eyes like polished steel, and said quietly, "You stole time, not money. And time is gone." Lena clutched my arm. I wanted to tell her I loved her, that it had all been worth it, that even if we died here, at least we had defied them. But the words stuck in my throat, useless. What happened after? That's the part one can't tell you. Maybe we died in that street, names forgotten, money scattered into the gutters of Philadelphia. Maybe we escaped, broken but breathing, living ghosts in another city where no one knew us. Maybe I'm telling you this from the grave, maybe from exile. The truth is, endings don't matter as much as what they cost. I took $6 million from the Russian mob, and in return they took everything I couldn't carry. Love, friendship, sleep, my own face in the mirror. Was it worth it? That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself. If this story held you, if it dragged you through every shadow and every lie, then leave a like and subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one, stories where the line between survival and damnation is thinner than a dollar bill, and sometimes the only thing you can do is run until the city decides whether you live or not.